Welcome to Reconnect, the podcast dedicated to sharing and defending the good news of Jesus Christ. All religions except Christianity require mankind to work to overcome our greatest problem. It is in Christianity alone that we have divine redemption through the person and work of Jesus of Nazareth, who through his life, death, and resurrection defeated sin, death, and the devil forever. Reconnect us, O Lord. Hey everyone, this is Andy Rasman. I am back from a very long break from this podcast. It's just been really busy in my life lately, and I haven't had the best recording time or situation or setup in the past few months. So we haven't had many episodes, but probably in the next 6 months or so, you will see this podcast back at full force with an episode every week. But I am back in particular now because my pastor wants to start a podcast, and he knew I had one, and he said, can you show me what you do? And I said, well, best way to do this would be, let's record one together. So my pastor is Pastor Arthur Andrews. He's the senior pastor, didn't start as a senior pastor, but now he's a senior pastor and actually the only pastor at Hephatha Lutheran Church in Anaheim Hills. It's hephatha.net, is that right, for the website? Mm-hmm. So Hephatha, most people go, what is that? I think you said something once in a sermon, the first time you saw the church sign, you thought of herpes. So do you mind clarifying Hephatha and what? Because to be honest, I've never heard a church with that name.
Not that. Hepatitis.
Oh, hepatitis.
Was what I was
really misspoke
thinking.
There, didn't I?
That's okay.
Well, you never know what people will walk away with from your sermons in it seems. Now that that's out of the way.
Thank you so much for the privilege and opportunity to be with you and to get a chance to talk and just kind of really think about how God might want to use technology in a way to spread the gospel, to impact people's lives, and to see people changed for the sake of the kingdom.
Yeah. So what was Hephatha again? Sorry.
Hephatha.
I know I threw you off on that one.
Mark chapter 7, verse 34, where Jesus speaks to the deaf man, where he says in Aramaic, Hephatha, which literally means to be open. So we're to be open to God, we're to be open to others, and we're to go and be open to be used by him.
Nice. And podcasts are certainly a way we can bring that message that opens us to the Lord, that creates that faith. So the question I had on it was, why do you want to make a podcast?
Well, I think that it's an opportunity to be able to connect with people in a variety of different ways. First, you can connect with more people via online than you could even in person. For example, I have a number of friends through apologetics.com and some other resources that have created podcasts that literally reach thousands of people. A number of years ago, probably now 14, 15 years ago, I was at a seminar where a pastor by the name of Greg Groeschel at Life Church TV, he talked about how he started this internet ministry, and now they have more than 1 million people that are connecting online with a church in one way or another. He also, incidentally, is the congregation that started the world-famous Bible app that is used by millions of people in America.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
So you're thinking this is just a great tool to reach more people.
I think you can reach people certainly through technology. I think there's a second thing. Oftentimes, leadership training or discipleship is both intensively difficult to get to because of conferences or cost. But when you have a podcast, if a person has a phone, they have an iPad, they have an opportunity to be able to connect right then and there. And I think what a remarkable tool that we have that even a previous generation or two ago we didn't. I remember when I went to St. Louis at Concordia, they had talked about the early days of the Lutheran Hour ministry and how they're the oldest radio program that's proclaiming the gospel, and how they took a medium that seems so simple and yet were able to touch people for the sake of God's kingdom, people coming to saving knowledge of Jesus.
Yeah, and speaking of the radio there, I know it's KFUO's, the LCMS, Lutheran Church Missouri Synods radio station, which is there in St. Louis. All their programs now are podcasts as well.
Yeah.
So you don't have to just be in the St. Louis area, happen to be driving around. You can listen to it whenever is convenient to your schedule to the program you actually want to listen to. So even most radio stations now are podcasting as well, or streaming live, so you can get it online. So definitely this is something a lot of people are tapping into, and I like the fact that you want to tap into it as well. So question on it, what did you have in mind for your podcast in terms of, I'm just curious, like, because I am a member of your congregation. Are you thinking this is more something you're going to be making for members in your congregation, or is it something that's for other pastors, or even a variety?
Yeah, what I was looking originally is doing a variety of things that are going to resource people. So one, I wanted to use it as an opportunity to go and train people up. It's kind of an equipping or a discipleship tool to help others really take a step of faith. For example, we've got a number of young adults who I think could have a great gifting in beginning to develop a teaching skill, perhaps apologetics, or even some other area of ministry. And so using that as a tool. Second, equipping people when they can't go to an event or an activity. Third, like a lot of LCMS churches, we have a ton of people that are elderly, that are shut in. Interestingly enough, a quick aside is that the average age for an LCMS member is about 68 years of age. Needless to say, a lot of those folks are suffering. So that could be an opportunity to connect with them. And then last, but certainly not least, what a great chance to go and be able to equip and encourage other pastors who oftentimes are in rural communities in the LCMS or elsewhere. And what we find also is it is a lot of time and expense. For example, my wife and I, we were apart for 4 years, PLI, Pastoral Leadership Institute. It was an absolutely wonderful program that helped partners, that is the wives and the pastors, to grow and develop as leaders. And so that's part of it. I really want to help people to grow as a leader. But what if they don't have all those thousands of dollars every single year that you have to come up with? What if they don't have weeks on end to be able to fly out of the state to visit some of these courageous Lutheran congregations? But what if you could provide a resource for them right where they're at that would both provide encouragement and practical tools for ministry?
Nice. Do you mind giving us some ideas about the type of topics then that may fit with what you're talking about?
So basically, we would have general Christian topics about spiritual disciplines, about growing as a follower of Christ. We would probably have another section that would be apologetics, answering the tough questions of the faith. Who is Jesus? How do you know that Christianity is the way? How can we really trust the Bible? Then we would have another section that would be particularly ministry and the challenges that we address in ministry. For example, more and more high school students are leaving our churches in the droves. So what if we actually talked about, for a series, how do we connect with students? And one of the things that I've discovered from talking with many people across denominational lines is that you've got to be intentional, you've got to build bridges, and you have to have those relationships and opportunity for them to invest meaningfully in ministry at different stages of their lives.
Yeah, well, I know you have been in ministry in various stages of your life, as well as serving people from various stages. So thinking about who should have a podcast, because people listening to this, one thing I would like for them to get from is like, hey, if their pastor is wanting to start a podcast, what might be some of the ideas behind it? Because not everyone has time to just talk to their pastor and be like, So you're starting a podcast. Why? And some people may be out there going, okay, well, here's why my pastor might be doing it. And some other listeners to this episode might be even thinking like, should I start a podcast? Because I know some pastors that listen, and I know some other teachers that maybe this is floating around in their head and hearing you say, okay, this is how it could be useful. It's like, do you think every teacher, every pastor should jump in on this? Because, I mean, you're saying great stuff.
Yeah. Do I think that there are many people who have great things to share with others? Yes. But what I'm going to be very honest, do I think everybody has the time? Do they have the resources? Do they have the connections in terms of researching or even going and connecting with people who would be on the show? No, not everybody does have that. However, I think you could do it in a variety of ways. I know several pastors that are in the area that they serve churches that aren't all that big, but their influence on a podcast has been significant. There is one pastor who I think is absolutely delightful. He's funny as all get out. His name is Pastor Swirla, and he is outstanding. He is down in Hacienda Heights, and what he's doing, he's taken all these different confessional aspects, and he will go through the small catechism, he'll go through the formula of concord, he'll go through the large catechism, he'll do all these different topics that you don't often get a chance to discuss, and that's an area where he's an expert. So I think, one, you have to look at your resources, look at your passion, look at also those areas in which you are particularly and uniquely gifted, and be honest and say, okay, does this have an opportunity to reach out to a broader community of faith? And if it does, then I think a lot of people do have a chance to start a podcast. And I think, for example, I know a number of people who the Thinking Fellows podcast.
Yes, yeah. It's taken off.
Yeah, those guys are great. They do an absolutely phenomenal job. They're a bunch of professors. They're in their area of strength, and they're utilizing and leveraging that. And one of my old former professors, Dr. Rod Rosenblatt, also I know is influential in that, and he was one of my profs. And again, just a wonderful communicator and presenter of the gospel.
And I have listened to that podcast, at least probably 10, 15 episodes. And what I enjoy is Professor Rod Rosenblatt, because he's also on the White Horse Inn.
Yeah.
And on the White Horse Inn, he's not as vocal from the least episodes I've heard.
No, I think you're exactly right.
And so for me, it's like, I want to hear more of him. And I only get like a minute or two in the whole episode, usually on the White Horse Inn. Here, sometimes he is the main speaker on the Thinking Fellows sometimes. So yeah, definitely. Certain people may have a certain voice that resonates with certain people. And like you said, geographically, you may not always be near a person with that voice. And so to me, that's the encouragement with podcasting is you may have a particular voice like you're talking about that may hit a certain type of person or certain audience. And I think we all have that. But in our local area, we may only have in your congregation or your Sunday school class a couple people that voice really resonates with.
Yeah, and I think what's really important, Andy, is this. This is really on my heart, is that your experiences, your education, your personality, all of these aspects, of course, including, the calling that God has for people, all of that has a way of impacting us for the sake of really reaching, as you said, different people. For me, I came from a good old-fashioned pagan background. I didn't grow up in the church. I didn't have any influence in the church. And so I look at things from a different perspective. For that matter, I also went back to school and served as a counselor with Lutheran Social Services. And so I have an MFT degree, and that was my background, and I did that for a number of years. And what I learned was that many of the problems, for example, we experience in ministry were not all the theological issues, although there certainly are theological issues. Please don't hear me say they're not. But a lot of them are relational. It's relationships or unhealthy people that hurt people because they've been hurt.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, good stuff there. You mentioned the Thinking Fellows. You mentioned Pastor Swirla's podcast. Do
Yeah.
you know the name of that one?
No, I don't know why I'm totally drawing a blank, but there's also a number of other just phenomenal leadership casts that I think Tom Rainier does one that I think is top notch, and perhaps the single best one I've ever seen is Kerry Newhoff. That man has a tremendous gift in regards to leadership, and his topics are thoughtful, engaging, timely, and he addresses things that it doesn't matter whether you're in the Lutheran Church or not. If you're trying to do ministry and you're a leader, you're going to get something out of that podcast. Andy Stanley also has one of the best podcasts I have heard.
Now, the Kerry Newhoff, I've listened to a few of his, and I think I might have discovered him from you, actually, sharing something once.
Yeah.
And what stood out to me is he has a slew of episodes, and every one he interviews someone who is a specialist in a certain field of leadership. So for me, it was, making videos. All right, he interviewed a guy that makes videos for church. Let me listen to that and get some tips. Or I think he even had one on marketing. So for me, I thought I had was, online marketing. I do have a blog. I do have a podcast. Can I get any tips for marketing? So it's I would say, like with podcasts, I've heard sometimes people feel like they have to be completionist and like listen to the whole thing for some reason. I guess some people are wired that way, but I would really encourage people to know if you don't have to listen to the whole thing. So I think some people get overwhelmed when they think of a podcast because they're like, oh, there's how many episodes? Oh, it's too much. I'm checking out. It's like, no, just pick the one that interests you. You know, like I said, Thinking Fellows, I've listened to 15 of them.
Yeah.
They have well over 60 now.
Yeah.
If not 100, because they've been out. Yeah. They've been really consistent.
Same thing with Issues, etc.
There's no way you can listen to that.
There's no way that I could, in clear conscience, have enough time to listen to all of those because I have small children. But I can enjoy the ones that really speak to me and connect with me and encourage me. And one of the things for me, again, every pastor is different, how they grow in their walk with Christ. But one of the things every single morning, I'm always listening to a couple podcasts. That's part of my devotional time. So I thought, well, if that's the way I'm wired and I enjoy that, why not allow others to be a part of that and share what God's kind of guiding and directing me in my life.
And I think there's always a time for new voices too, because I've kind of experienced this. Once you've listened to a particular pastor or teacher long enough, you'll sometimes find they repeat themselves or have topics that they always fall back on, which isn't a bad thing because we need to hear the gospel every day, every week at church. So I think some people may be, there's a new voice, a new something here. So I think just that may be an encouragement to listeners now, even to hear that pastors are listening to other pastors, teachers are listening to other teachers. And if we're really honest with ourselves, most of everything we share is borrowed from someone before that we've read or heard, even if we don't consciously know where it came from.
Yeah, I can't remember which of my profs in seminary said this, but they kind of gave us a warning. They said, for every one living person that you're reading or read it, like listening to, make sure that you read at least 2 dead people. And his point was that there's previous generations that have so much to share with us that can impact us and guide and direct us in the future. And so some of the guys will tell me they read Pietism of the 17th century in the Lutheran culture, Pia Desideria and other works like that, while others are very heavy into reading the second Martin Chemnitz, and they absolutely love reading, about the hypostatic union, and that's something that really drives them with joy. But nonetheless, yes, I think there's different voices, there's different opportunities for us to grow, and everybody has something we can learn from. Don't think that you have been so educated and have learned so much that you can't have a posture of a student.
Yeah, good words. And we all are students as disciples, right, of Jesus. So before we move right into the next topic, which is still using 21st century technology, mainly internet technology to share the gospel. I just wanted to let every listener know, if you go to andyrasman.com, you will see a link for Reconnect, find this episode, and I'll have links there. So whenever Pastor Arthur gets his podcast up and running, the link to his podcast will be there. And I'll give some links to some of these other podcasts that we're mentioning. Also, hearing what resources do you need? How do you go about this? How much time does it take? I'll give a link to a PDF that someone else put together, again, standing on what people have done before, that walks through, here's the best programs, here's how to get it on iTunes, here's how to get it into Stitcher or other sources used, here's how much you should expect it to cost to host your podcast. He even explains what level of hosting you would want. All that's there. There's no need for me to share that right now. This is more, should a church have a podcast and why? So all that will be there, andyrasman.com. Just find this episode. This episode I'm going to label Sharing the Gospel in the 21st Century. So just search 21st Century Sharing the Gospel. You'll get it. All the links will be there. It's kind of, I guess this podcast to me is more of a launching pad to give other people resources. And like you said, things that I've benefited from. Oh, I'd like to share it with others, and this just happens to be one venue I've found to do it. Another venue of sharing the gospel, which I've seen you use, so I wanted to hear feedback because I never got to talk to you too much on how it went, was you taught a online Old Testament, was it, class, right?
Yeah.
It was specifically Old Testament, which is a good topic because that's what we're probably most familiar or least familiar with sometimes. Is
and we've done this a couple of times in our church. We've done an Old Testament introduction, and we've done also a New Testament introduction in the last couple of years. Long story short, what we did is we would weekly send an email, and in that email, they would have links. And those links would lead them to YouTube. It would lead them to our website at church. It would lead them to Facebook. And we would go and utilize that and leverage that. And it was incredible, some of the discussions that we were able to have with people. And here's the thing. At the time, for us, to get people to come to an Old Testament class was rather daunting. But somehow we made it understandable, and we also did it in a way that you could take a more academic approach, kind of secondarily easier approach, but still pretty rigorous. And then finally, if you wanted to kind of coast, if you will, you could just absorb some of the things that you were watching. And we also utilized just an incredible web series that has taken the entire Bible and provided an overview of all of the Bible studies that you could imagine, like all throughout the Old Testament and New Testament as well.
So I just heard you say YouTube as well.
Yeah.
That's another option. But like you just mentioned, this one church made a series.
Yeah.
And now you're using that series with other people. So it's very fascinating how you can put things online and it can get legs that you have, or wings, because I guess it is a cloud. You have no idea where it's going to end up necessarily.
Yeah. You know what's kind of the most interesting story? I heard this probably, it's got to be close to 18, 19 years ago. And the story was given by Pastor Rick Warren, not too far in South County from here. And he talked about how there was a gentleman, he didn't have internet, but he went to an internet cafe every single week. He would download one of Pastor Rick's messages. Then he would translate it in the common language of the people and make it fit that culture. And he would preach it. And literally, that small handful of people grew into a vibrant, active congregation. And I thought to myself, my goodness, I bet you when Rick Warren was sitting in his rather nice office in Saddleback Church and he was typing away his message, I don't think at that moment he was thinking of that African pastor who just had a heart for the gospel. He heard about Rick Warren and some of the things that they were doing with the peace plan, and that's kind of how he even got introduced to his name, ever thought that his words would in some way be used to really point to the word
Yeah.
and ultimately the living word,
Right.
Jesus.
And maybe an encouragement too, because most people listening may be going, "Well, I'm not Rick Warren." People can easily search and find him, right?
Yeah.
Because they already know his name. Uh, but I've had people, even with my meager number of downloads from this podcast, like I usually in the first episode or first week that's an episode's out, 50 to 100 downloads. When I've been consistent and I get an episode out every week, that number can sometimes grow to 150 or 200. But if something happens in life and I get derailed, like it goes back down to like 50 usually when I release for the first week. But it still hangs out there, which is the fun thing because it keeps racking. But I've had, if you can look at most, I use Libsyn, it will tell me what countries are downloading.
Wow.
And when I post videos to YouTube, it will tell me, as well as my blog on WordPress. So pretty much every hosting site you're going to use to put stuff out there will give you the type of feedback to let you know what countries. You can even find out what states, what cities.
Wow.
And I found that I have a decent number of people in China and India following me. Now, China, I looked at it. Oh, it's from the city that I lived in. And I have no idea who the 12 people are in that city that might have downloaded something from 1 week. But I'm like,
That's great.
Who are these people? And so you don't have to be Rick Warren is my point.
No,
like you will be baffled at where this stuff will go online.
And Andy, this will blow you away. So part of the inspiration for a lot of this, why I want to do online ministry more and more, is really my own son. So about 8 or 9 months ago, he was on Instagram. And he said, Dad, I bet you I can get a few people to check this out. And I'm like, well, why don't you try? And so the first time he did it, he got like 400 or 500 people. I thought, boy, that's not too shabby.
That's really good.
And then the second time that he did it, he got 4,500 people. And I said, that's pretty impressive. And then a couple months after that, his third effort, he put it out there. He had over 45,000 people check out what he posted. And I thought to myself, my goodness, here's my 12-year-old kid who is posting something that did connect with people. And he had an opportunity. So I'm not saying that you and I are lesser than a 12-year-old kid, but what I am saying is this is an opportunity to connect with people. And we never even always know what's going to connect with an audience of people.
Yeah, and you never know when something will drastically take off, like you're saying. I had a student here once made some post on Twitter about her grandparents. And somehow news agencies found out about it. And it's just, hey, my grandparents have been going to the same In-N-Out to eat burgers every Wednesday for the last whatever number of years. And somehow someone's like, that's cool. Let's talk to these people. And now it's like on national news type. And she literally showed it to me. I'm like, this is a lot to think about. Just you never know what will take off, which is what I think with the online world is just keep putting material out there. As long as it's Christ focused.
Yeah.
And how are you going to necessarily, how would you go wrong?
Yeah. And I think, again, like you said, you don't realize what's going to connect and trigger with other people. I mean, I actually know people, like in my times of counseling at the local church, where people were at a point of major desperation. I mean, they were down at a point where they were like, I don't know if I want to continue to live. And then they found a podcast. And I know that I'm not just saying that to go and make people want to do this, but when I heard those stories that they just came upon something, they clicked on it, and it gave them a word of encouragement. And I thought to myself, wow, God can use all these different venues. Of course, they're centered in the Word and, of course, focused on Christ and his work at the cross. But what a remarkable thing that something as simple as an app or something that somebody came across while they were surfing the web, and in a point of crisis, while they just really weren't sure if they wanted to continue, and they heard a message of hope and healing and restoration that's found in Christ.
Yeah, and it would be nice if we were more connected physically with each other and community.
Yeah.
But nowadays, most of our interactions are online, it seems. And I find, like what you just said, reminds me, well, God will go to where you are,
Yeah.
right? So God definitely, even though we may go, well, that's not the best community, right, necessarily.
No, I don't think that there's ever replacing real live relationships. A podcast should not be a replacement for local church, nor should it be a replacement for real Christian community.
Mm-hmm.
However, can you be blessed by a podcast? Can it touch your life? And the answer, of course, is yeah.
And it might potentially even connect to real life personal community.
Yeah.
So it's certainly something to dive into. I kind of want to backtrack a little bit to that class.
Okay.
To go back to that, how did it go? What type of feedback did you get from people in the church? Did it seem like a decent percentage of people were involved? Like maybe even more so than if you had picked a Wednesday night?
Yeah, I think so. I think it had more people than I typically would have. And what I discovered is it also had people that I didn't expect to get. That was the big surprise to me. There were all these folks who I didn't think had much of an interest in learning Old Testament or New Testament, and yet here they were, and they were talking about the book that we were reading, which incidentally happened to be a textbook that Concordia University in Irvine uses. And so they loved the book, and several of the people actually bought extra copies and gave it to some of their friends and family.
Yeah. And I have a men's group. We're off the radar on officially being listed at the church, but we meet late at night because that's kind of the best time for us as guys with 2 and 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds. Like, okay, let's get the kids to bed and then we'll go out. But we weren't posting online as much with these discussions, but we were taking some of that material and then discussing it when we gathered. So you probably didn't know that, but we were actually using the stuff. And we did take not the expert, not the medium. We took like the lowest, like what should we read today? And we would kind of bring it to the meeting. Someone would print the stuff out and we would show up and talk through it. So it was definitely being used maybe in ways you didn't know. If you were to do the class again, what would you do differently in terms of getting people signed up? In terms of maybe the conversations, like was it mostly on your Facebook public wall? Did you have a group page?
Yeah. I used the Facebook my page, and that was okay. But I would probably add 2 more components to it. I would do a live video chat.
Oh, cool.
Because I think that could be a fun thing, maybe at the beginning of the class and at the end of the class, so that we can kind of answer questions that people might have before they dive into it. And then lastly, we could debrief and really connect with people and see what questions maybe still were left swirling in their minds. And the second thing I think I would have done, I probably would have tried to utilize maybe even more social media venues. And what I mean by that is I probably would have used both Instagram and even Twitter for those who had that as well.
And I'm not certain. Obviously, we could probably find someone like your son, Ben, who could confirm for us. But I'm pretty sure with like Instagram, I'm rather certain with Twitter, if you tweet something, you can have it programmed to automatically post on your Facebook page as well.
Yes.
So people may hear, I got to post in multiple sites, and it's not necessarily that
extensive,
way. Now, I don't know if Instagram works the same way, where if you could post on Instagram and it shows up in some of the other venues or not.
Yeah, I honestly don't know, but I can guarantee you this, that we, even at church, we do a similar thing. So I do a weekly letter also that's online. So we went to that, and I have that posted on multiple mediums at once.
I know it's on the website,
yeah,
hephatha.net. Before we came to the church the first time, I did read the letter you sent out.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So I was like, okay. So I think nowadays, before people visit a church, they'll oftentimes scope it out online.
Yeah.
So the website is actually because very, very rarely people are going to drive by and be like, Hephatha.
Yeah, especially after that introduction earlier.
Hephatha the name might lead people to the website nowadays too, because they're like, "What is that?"
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. But what's interesting is you're exactly right. What I've discovered, I kind of did a little research and asked larger churches in the Orange County community,
Mm-hmm.
what are you finding that's going on that's a new trend when it comes to social media? And what they all said to me was almost universally the exact same thing. So I talked to people at Your Belinda Friends. I talked to people at Saddleback. I talked to
Mm-hmm.
people at Mariners. I talked to all these folks. And the thing that the university said is, number one, people are checking not only the services out, but also different things going on their site long before they ever go on
Long
the
before.
campus. And so
Wow.
what's happening is people are checking it out, not just even for a week or two, but many of the folks are saying, yeah, I've been listening for a couple of months. And then they come on the campus and try out the church, if you will, and see what it's about.
Yes, that'd be interesting. Like this class you're talking about, even if that can somehow be posted on a website somehow, where people can even
Yeah.
scope out a class from without actually being involved. Even
Yeah. We did also like a simple thing like a 30 days of prayer, and I did it on my Facebook page.
mm-hmm.
And what I did is I had a quote or two that I thought was pertinent. Then we had a scripture, and then finally we had a prayer that I would write down,
Yeah.
and people could engage in that way. And that was a great and simple way to utilize some of the resources that are right before us, because a lot of people are intimidated by things that seem complex. And what I'm finding is you have early adopters who love all the social media, but then you've got a lot of folks who are terrified of jumping on the computer, or they're confused about an app, or and we've got apps too,
Mm-hmm.
for both the iPhone as well as for the Android. But a lot of folks don't do that. So having that as a venue, and that's what I discovered, that every place was different and each person was different. So some people, the email was like a big stretch for them.
Mm-hmm.
And then Facebook was another stretch for others. And then having multiple venues in different social media was a stretch.
Yeah. Well, I like what you said about putting it in multiple locations. What I have seen, and I have yet to get on Instagram, partly because do I have the time to navigate it, but when I first started teaching at the high school level, most of my students had Facebook. A lot of students wanted to add me, and I just kind of said, "Don't add. If you send me something after you graduate, I'll hit add." But I don't want mine. It's a weird dynamic, maybe a little different than pastor to minor.
No, I
I'm
think
not
that
sure,
there's
but
some truth to that. Like when a kid is younger, I'm kind of more reticent to go
Yeah.
put them on my friend list.
But what I've discovered is throughout, because I've been here now, this is my 9th year teaching here. After each graduating class, I get less friend requests on Facebook. And I've noticed, I've asked some students, like, how many of you got Facebook? Most of them don't have Facebook now. They've gone to Instagram, like what you said Ben's using. So it's kind of interesting to consider, like, if you want to reach a 20-year and younger audience, you're probably going to need Instagram now. And Facebook's going to be more the 30-year-old.
Yeah, 30,
60.
40, 50, 60. I think, what happened was the way that the students in my confirmation class told me, they said, oh, yeah, we made sure we got off Facebook as soon as
Parents.
our mom and dad came
Yeah.
on.
Uh-huh.
So
it's a sinful reason, maybe.
Maybe
it's hard to judge, but I was reckon it is.
That might be a part of it, but I think also the way that they're expressing themselves, a lot of students, also including my son, they're on Snapchat.
Right.
And so Snapchat has kind of
huge.
taken over, I think, where Facebook would have been. But again, remarkable because it creates, these memories, and these memories stay up for a little while, but then they disappear, kind of, sort of.
Unless you put it on your storyline, I believe.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's like the other one, it's like 24 hours.
Yeah.
So, even then, which I guess is smart, right? Because you don't want they call it a digital tattoo. You put it on most places. Well, thanks for sharing how it went with the class and some of the things you would do differently with it. I know you've also taught classes online, theology classes, at the high school level and college level, so in a different venue than in a congregational setting where there aren't grades.
Yeah.
Did you see much of a difference there? Did you do anything different?
Yeah, I
And
have to say this. The stuff that I did with Olu, for example, was interesting in that people have to be very, very disciplined. And what I found with some of the students, they weren't nearly as disciplined. I think they need to be a little bit older to get
okay.
as much out of an online course. The second thing is I was surprised as to just the depth and breadth that some of these students had. I was just so taken aback. There were some kids that I think they could go and think circles around many adults in terms of theology. But for Concordia, with their online program, so we use different venues, and the one they do is Blackboard Connect. And it's a interesting way. And we do the live chat sessions, and you have interaction and video and so forth and so on. And you have weekly videos that you create that prepare the students for each of the things. But for me, while I love the teaching part and even the grading part was kind of fun, the part that I absolutely loved the most was that in every single class, we would have students that were Muslim. We would have students that were not anything. They were, in some cases, atheists. And some of them were really confused as to the most basic of biblical doctrines. And this gave an opportunity to stop and listen. And one of the things that I did is something I stole from Timothy Keller. I wish I could tell you that it was original with me. It wasn't. I kept listening on a podcast to Timothy Keller, and Tim Keller started answering all these people's questions after the church service when he used to be at Redeemer in New York, and has since retired, but he's still doing a lot of work, obviously, that's gospel-centered. But he simply stopped and allowed people to ask questions. And so since that time, I have always taken, when I teach these classes, both at the beginning, in the middle, and then finally I'll even do it at the end, is tell me what your question is, and I'm going to attempt to answer it. I don't guarantee that I have all the answers, but I know a lot of good resources, and I can research it for you and find out.
Yeah. There's a Lutheran church in Knoxville called The Point.
Oh, yeah.
They
Matt
do that
Peoples.
as well. Oh, yeah, Matt Peoples.
He used to be there. He recently took a call to Bethlehem Lutheran.
Okay, yeah, because my parents live in Knoxville. They've visited there a couple times. That's not where they're members. They told me the services there after the sermon, there's an opportunity to ask questions, but using technology, it's anonymous, where you text your question to a certain number. And I assume someone can screen them, but then they can pop them up on the screen. Using whatever the program is, it looks nice. Everyone gets to see it. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting the way they use technology there, because if you did want everyone to feel free to ask the question, you may want some level of
anonymity.
And anonymity, and then it would be a long process if you had to submit papers, and it's like, well, only one person submitted a paper, we know whose question it is. So it's kind of cool to okay, because I guarantee you a lot of people would just okay, I gotta get on my phone now, and so a lot of, even if only one question submitted, I bet multiple people would be on their phones during that time. So it would give a little level of secrecy there, and safety for people to really ask questions.
And it's interesting because they're certainly not the first ones to do this. In fact, back in the 80s, my wife had a friend, Adam Ayers, who I think is still in the community. He used to pastor a church called the Disciples Church in Costa Mesa, and he would take hours with people afterwards and just answer questions and talk with folks. And what's interesting, even prior to that time, there was a wonderful apologetics couple, Bob and Gretchen Passantino, and they would not just talk hours. They would literally talk through the entire night with people. And I was there on one of those nights. It was like 3:30 in the morning. And I was like, I don't think I can handle learning any more about the Nicene Creed. I'm cool right now. I need to go home and get some sleep. But it was absolutely remarkable to see 40, 50, 60 young adults primarily who were just so engaged and wanted to talk and connect.
Yeah. Any other ideas for 21st century technology
Yeah,
for sharing the gospel that churches could use? Anything else rattling in your brain?
I think again, simple things like we're already doing and talking about. I think churches can post things that are thought provoking and encouraging. I think that ministries can send emails, even as old school as that sounds. That's a great venue for a lot of people. And also taking like your smartphones, it's not that expensive to get an app created for a smartphone that's representing your church. So in that app, you can have things like about what's going on and happening on a weekly basis. I know a lot of congregations that are like church plants do that. And then they also give you the venue and opportunity to connect. And they do a phenomenal job.
Yeah, good. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Last question I had, and I didn't give you this in advance, it's just on the paper. Politics on social media. I know I share a decent bit of things that would be considered political. And sometimes a lot of them, from my perspective, deal with things that would be dealing with morality, traditional marriage versus same-sex marriage versus monogamish versus polygamy, which is actually going there, or polyamory. I've heard them
polyamorous,
and I've even heard this pansexual stuff. It's all out there, and some of that stuff bleeds into transgender and who's allowed in what bathrooms, and I see all of that as ultimately hurting children in some way. They in the end will hurt, and I think from there society will hurt because family is the bedrock of society. And I just kind of have to throw that out there right now because that's hopefully you believe me, whoever's listening. Hopefully you believe me on that. I think it is the bedrock of society, even non-Christian society. Families are needed for society to continue and to have and be strong. So I feel like it's an attack on children and society. And so I will, since a lot of in our nation are a lot of laws now being focused on this stuff. It's a big focus on a lot of all our elections, as well as abortion, which I don't see how a Christian could say that's not murder. So I post things along these lines, and I see a lot of it as being, in a way, very law-centered. And maybe other people see that, and I received something once along the lines of almost you're muddling your message by having all these posts. And I was like, oh, okay, well, just curious your thoughts on that, how to navigate that. If you're going to be posting scripture and theology, do you stray from some of that stuff?
I don't think you can stray from the culture because theology that is good theology does impact the culture because it impacts our lives. So to pursue theology, for example, for theology's sake, just so that I can be an academic or quote great theologians from the 4th, 5th, and 6th century, doesn't really quite do it for me. But I do think this. I agree with Luther that we have the kingdom of the right and kingdom of the left. So there are some things that don't always mix, if you will. But at the same time, I think to remain silent and not to address these things, there is something very wrong for us as a Christian not to be open and honest. The other thing, I didn't plan on this, but I'll just share it with you, is sometimes it just saddens me what I'm seeing in our culture today. I remember while we were preparing, for the elections, a little over a year ago, and the culture and the feeling where people were at odds and how you couldn't have an opinion that didn't represent a certain view and vice versa. And there was not an open, caring, thoughtful discussion or dialogue that was going on. And I still think to some extent that this is something that we're dealing with in our culture. And this is why, whether it's a political post or it's something that's addressing, very important social concerns, like, as you said, what is marriage? What about the sanctity of life and things of that nature? We as Christians have to engage. However, I do think that Christians can be intelligent, articulate, and engage and they can do so in a loving manner. And that's the other flip side, that sometimes maybe we don't always come off as kind and centered on Christ, and so people blow us off. It's kind of like even apologetics at its core. I always look back, that Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15 passage. It says, speak the truth in love. And so I don't see love and truth as mutually exclusive, one from the other. Rather, I believe that they work in tandem together. So, you see some people who say, well, I'm like a prophetic person. I just tell it like it is. I'm like, no, you're kind of being mean. And then on the flip side, oh, I would never want to hurt anybody's feelings. I want to be loving. Well, is it loving to allow people to hurt themselves or to hurt others? So again, I go back to Paul's mandate about speaking truth, but doing so in a loving way. And I think that's absolutely essential. So I think that's the principle I would live by if I'm trying to make a lot of political posts. For me, while I appreciate politics, and in fact, part of my spiritual journey was when I was 17 years old, I was going to go to Berkeley and be a poli-sci major, go off to law school, and then make my millions at a large law firm, which, needless to say, did not happen. But the point being is, I'm not opposed to these things. But at the end of the day, I also believe that if we show God's love, care, and concern for people, we have to speak. If we do not, we cannot remain silent when others don't have a voice. We have to speak up. Whether it's for the unborn, whether it's for those who are stuck in the cycle of poverty, it's women nowadays, who are standing up because of the sexual abuse that they have experienced, whatever the case may be. We have to, by the grace and mercy of Jesus, be willing to speak, but do so in a way that honors Jesus. And I think you can address virtually any issue. And I'll say one last thing on this rather challenging topic is this, that I've discovered that I, as a pastor, can say a lot of very hard things to people about their lives if deep down inside they know that I'm coming from a place of love. And so I kind of believe that posture goes a long way when addressing difficult political issues, when it's really coming from a place of love, that I'm not here to judge or to attack or to hate people. And again, do I think that there's agendas? Of course I do. Do I believe that there's some very weird things that are coming up the pike in our government and in our public schools and certainly in the media? No doubt about it. I believe J.P. Moreland was correct when he talked about these different kingdom triangles and their influence in our society. So I wholeheartedly agree with that. But that being said, again, I think we need to do so with that posture of service and Christ-centeredness, and that will open the door to speak that powerful truth in people's lives.
Yeah, well, thanks for that word of advice on this, because I know my social media feed's largely political. So sometimes it's like what I share ends up being the same, just because I'm usually, I like this article, let me hit share. But it could be daunting, and I'll have to pray about and think about how to maybe put some of these in a atmosphere of love, or a posture of love, as you used the term. Everyone listening, this has been Pastor Arthur Andrews with me, pastor at Hephatha Lutheran Church in Anaheim Hills. Hephatha.net is our website. We have a church and a school, kindergarten through 8th grade. I'm not sure how long the school's been around, or the church, but a long time, right?
Yeah, we've been in the Anaheim Hills community as a congregation since 1974. So 43, 44 years. We had a preschool just celebrate 40 years last year in 2017, and we're just about to celebrate another 40th anniversary, another 2 years for the elementary school, I believe.
Yeah. That's so. If you're in the area, if you're visiting Disneyland, we're not too far away. Yeah. So if you're around on a Sunday looking for a church and you're out of town or listening to the podcast, going to see Mickey, consider coming over to Hephatha. Visit us there. Before I close, maybe just a word of encouragement to you. Something that I think you do very well is giving accolades to people when they do good work. or when they do good service. And I think that's very important because you realize the church isn't one person. It's the body of Christ with many different gifts, many different roles. And you do make a very important point of bringing the whole congregation into celebrating milestones like you mentioned. I knew the 40-year because we just observed it, celebrated it in the church service. But I forgot if it was the preschool or the elementary or whatnot. So, but that's good. And I really think you do a great job at that. So I appreciate that from you, and certainly will try to take that and apply it into my future roles in service in the kingdom. Listeners, just want to leave you with the good news. It's that Jesus Christ died for you, died for all of your sins, that he was buried, that he was raised to life again. When we have faith in him, when we're grounded and rooted in him, drawn to him, we have confidence that when we die, we too will live again, have new bodies at Christ's return, that we will be with God forever. And that simple message, which can go out word of mouth speaking, can go out written, can go out through podcast, is the message that reconnects us into a right relationship with the Lord.
Your mission, if you choose to accept it. Share this episode on all of your social media sites and with your email contacts, people who will benefit from listening to the show. Thank you for listening. Reconnect us, O Lord.